If you walk through Red Square in Moscow today, you will see the ghosts of an empire that collapsed under its own weight. You will see tourists photographing Lenin's tomb, a monument to a revolution that promised to bury capitalism. You will see the Kremlin's towers, symbols of a superpower that once controlled half of Europe. You will see McDonald's and Starbucks where Soviet citizens once waited in bread lines. In 1985, the Soviet Union was not just a superpower. It was a nuclear colossus with over 45,000 warheads aimed at Western cities. It was an empire spanning 11 time zones and controlling over 286 million people. It was a military machine that fielded 5 million soldiers and produced more tanks, submarines, and missiles than any nation in history. The Soviet leadership believed they could match American military spending dollar for dollar. They believed their command economy could outproduce the capitalist West. They believed the correlation of forces was shifting in their favor. But they forgot one critical thing. They forgot that empires collapse not when their armies are defeated, but when their treasuries run dry. They did not realize that the most effective weapon in modern warfare is not a missile. It is a ledger. This is the story of how the United States destroyed the Soviet Union. The Americans did it not by launching a single nuclear weapon, but by forcing the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion. This is not a story of military victory. It is a story of economic strangulation. It is the ultimate lesson in how financial pressure can accomplish what a million soldiers cannot. When you understand this strategy, you understand the future of great power competition. To understand how America won the Cold War, we must go back to 1945. The world had just emerged from the most destructive conflict in human history. Two superpowers stood alone amid the rubble. The United States possessed 40% of global GDP, an intact industrial base, and a monopoly on nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe, commanded the world's largest army, and nursed ambitions of global revolution. On the surface, the Soviet economy appeared formidable. Soviet planners boasted about economic growth rates that exceeded 7% annually throughout the 1950s. They launched Sputnik before America reached space. They built tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. They created a military-industrial complex that employed 1 in 4 Soviet workers. Western observers saw these achievements and worried the communists might actually win. But beneath this surface of military might lay a fundamentally broken system. The Soviet economy was not an economy at all. It was a military production facility masquerading as a nation. Every factory, every resource, every worker served one purpose: build weapons. The Soviet system could produce tanks but not tractors. It could manufacture missiles but not medicines. It could construct submarines but not sufficient housing for its people. The man who would exploit this weakness entered the White House in January 1981. Ronald Reagan was not a traditional Cold War strategist. He was not an academic or a diplomat. He was an ideological warrior who believed the Soviet Union was destined to fail. Reagan understood something the defense establishment had missed. The Soviet economy was a house of cards. One strong gust would collapse the entire structure. Reagan realized that the Soviet Union was trapped in a fatal contradiction. They needed to maintain military parity with the United States to preserve their superpower status. But maintaining that parity required spending an ever-increasing percentage of national income on defense. The Soviet economy was growing at 3% annually. American defense spending could grow at 5% without breaking the budget. The mathematics of empire were brutally simple. In a prolonged arms race, the smaller economy would bleed first. This was the original sin of Soviet economic planning. Joseph Stalin had created a system optimized for wartime mobilization. It could produce vast quantities of military hardware by commandeering resources and conscripting labor. But it could never match the innovation, efficiency, and wealth generation capacity of market economies. The Soviet system was designed to win World War II. It was catastrophically unprepared to win the Cold War. Soviet leadership made their fateful choice in the late 1940s. As America demobilized after World War II, reducing military spending from 38% of GDP in 1945 to 5% by 1948, the Soviets did the opposite. They maintained wartime spending levels. They built a nuclear arsenal. They subsidized communist movements from Cuba to Vietnam. They poured resources into client states that produced nothing but geopolitical headaches. The numbers tell the story. By 1980, the Soviet Union was spending between 15 and 17% of GDP on defense. The United States spent 6%. The Soviet economy was one-third the size of America's. Do the math. The Soviets were spending 3 to 4 times more of their national wealth on weapons than their adversary. They were digging a hole to pay for another hole. It was economic suicide in slow motion. The trap snapped shut on March 23, 1983. Ronald Reagan appeared on national television and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. He called it a shield against nuclear missiles. Soviet intelligence called it something else. Star Wars. The Soviets believed Reagan was deploying space-based lasers and particle beam weapons that would make Soviet missiles obsolete. They believed America had achieved a technological breakthrough that would render their 45,000 warheads useless. In reality, Star Wars was a bluff. A magnificent, catastrophically expensive bluff. The technology did not exist. The physics were questionable. The cost estimates ranged into the hundreds of billions of dollars, but Reagan did not need Star Wars to work. He needed the Soviets to believe it would work. He needed them to respond. And they did. Within months, the Soviet General Staff convened emergency meetings to counter the American initiative. They commissioned studies. They allocated research budgets. They diverted scientists from civilian projects to military laboratories. They began developing their own space-based defense systems. The cost projections were staggering. Some Soviet economists estimated it would require spending an additional 2 to 3% of GDP annually just to keep pace with American research. Think about what that meant. The Soviet economy was already spending 17% on defense. Now they needed to spend 20%, maybe 22%. In a command economy growing at 2 to 3% annually, that kind of military spending meant systematic impoverishment. It meant no resources for housing, no money for consumer goods, no investment in agriculture. The Soviet people would pay for Star Wars with empty shelves and broken promises, but Star Wars was just the opening move. The Reagan administration had discovered a magic trick. They could force Soviet spending increases without proportional American costs. Every dollar America spent on research required the Soviets to spend $3 to maintain parity. The exchange rate favored America because American technology was more advanced and American industry more efficient. The Soviets needed to spend more to achieve less. The addiction phase began in earnest. Between 1981 and 1985, American defense spending increased by 40% in real terms. The Pentagon ordered B-1 bombers, Trident submarines, MX missiles, and 600 ship navy. Much of this spending went to systems the Soviets had to counter. Each American weapons system spawned a Soviet response program. Each response program bled the Soviet treasury a little more. By the mid-1980s, it had turned into a Ponzi scheme. The Soviets were borrowing from future growth to pay for current weapons. They were deferring civilian investment to fund military programs. They were printing rubles to cover budget deficits. The official numbers showed 3% growth. The actual numbers told a different story. Western intelligence agencies estimated real Soviet growth had fallen below 1% by 1985. Then Reagan deployed the second weapon, oil. The Soviet Union was a petrostate. Roughly 60% of hard currency earnings came from oil and gas exports. In 1980, oil traded at $35 per barrel. Soviet planners built their budgets assuming prices would remain high. They spent the oil revenue before they pumped the oil. Classic resource curse economics. The Reagan administration worked with Saudi Arabia to flood the market. The Saudis opened the taps. They increased production from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1985 to 5.5 million barrels per day by 1986. Oil prices collapsed from $32 per barrel in November 1985 to $10 by July 1986. The price remained suppressed for years. Do the arithmetic. At $30 per barrel, the Soviets earned roughly $30 billion annually from oil exports. At $10 per barrel, they earned $10 billion. $20 billion disappeared. $20 billion the Soviet military-industrial complex expected to receive. $20 billion that would not pay for tanks, submarines, or space-based defense systems. The warning signs became impossible to ignore. Soviet citizens noticed the shelves were emptier. The bread lines were longer. The housing construction had stopped. The promises of communist abundance rang hollow when workers spent hours queuing for basic necessities. In 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died after 18 years of economic stagnation. His successor, Yuri Andropov, lasted 15 months before kidney failure killed him. Konstantin Chernenko survived 13 months in office. Soviet economists began writing classified reports warning of systemic crisis. One report to the Politburo in 1983 estimated that maintaining military parity with the United States would require the Soviet Union to allocate 25% of GDP to defense by 1990. 25%. In an economy that was actually shrinking. The math was impossible. The empire could not afford its own defense. But the Soviet leadership faced an impossible choice: reduce military spending and lose superpower status, or maintain spending and impoverish the population. They chose impoverishment. They always chose impoverishment, because the Soviet system was not designed to produce prosperity. It was designed to produce power, and power required weapons. The desperate measures began. The Soviets borrowed from Western banks. They sold gold reserves. They negotiated grain purchases from America when Soviet agriculture failed to feed the population. They signed unfavorable trade deals with Eastern European satellites who demanded subsidies. They borrowed from Peter to pay Paul, from Paul to pay Ivan, from Ivan to pay the generals who controlled the missiles. By 1985, every kopeck collected from a factory worker in Novosibirsk, every ruble earned from oil wells in Siberia, every dollar borrowed from German banks flowed into the military-industrial complex. The Soviet Union had become a nation that existed to fund its own destruction. The addiction was complete. The tipping point arrived on December 24, 1979. Soviet paratroopers landed in Kabul, Afghanistan. The invasion was supposed to be quick. Soviet military planners estimated they would stabilize the country in 6 to 12 months. They would install a friendly government. They would withdraw most forces. The operation would cost perhaps $2 to $3 billion. 9 years later, the war was still grinding on. At the exact same time the Soviets were trying to fund Star Wars countermeasures, at the exact moment oil revenues were collapsing, they were bleeding resources in Afghanistan. The war consumed $15 billion annually. Over 100,000 Soviet soldiers rotated through Afghan combat zones. 15,000 came home in coffins. The cost kept rising. American weapons flowed to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. Stinger missiles turned Soviet helicopters into flying coffins. The war became Soviet Vietnam, unwinnable, interminable, a sucking chest wound bleeding money and morale. The Soviet treasury was expected to fund a strategic arms race against America while simultaneously financing a counterinsurgency war in Central Asia. The income collapsed, but the obligations remained fixed. Oil revenue fell by $20 billion. The Afghan war cost $15 billion annually. Star Wars countermeasures required another $10 to $15 billion in research funding. The numbers did not work. Soviet planners stared at spreadsheets that refused to balance. You cannot spend what you do not have. In March 1985, a younger generation of Soviet leadership took power. Mikhail Gorbachev became general secretary at age 54. He looked at the ledgers and realized the game was up. The treasury was approaching bankruptcy. Hard currency reserves were depleting. The Soviet Union was months away from defaulting on foreign loans. The economy was in free fall. Gorbachev attempted desperate reforms. He announced glasnost, openness. He proclaimed perestroika, restructuring. He allowed Soviet economists to speak publicly about the crisis. They confirmed what Western intelligence had suspected. The Soviet economy had stopped growing entirely. Some estimates suggested it was contracting by 2% annually. The Soviet Union faced a choice they had successfully avoided for 40 years: cut military spending or starve the population. There was no third option. The mathematics of empire had reached their inexorable conclusion. The smaller economy could not match the larger economy's military spending without systematic impoverishment. Gorbachev chose to cut. In December 1988, he announced at the United Nations that the Soviet Union would unilaterally reduce its military forces by 500,000 troops. He withdrew forces from Eastern Europe. He canceled weapons programs. He stopped subsidizing communist movements in the Third World. The cuts were presented as peace initiatives. In reality, they were forced by empty coffers. The Soviet military-industrial complex realized what was happening. Gorbachev was dismantling the empire to save the economy. He was trading superpower status for economic survival. The generals understood the implications. If the Soviet Union could not afford to compete with America militarily, it was no longer a superpower. It was just Russia with nuclear weapons. On August 19, 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup. They arrested Gorbachev. They rolled tanks into Moscow. They tried to restore the Soviet Empire. They failed within 72 hours. The coup collapsed because the money was gone. You cannot run an empire on an empty treasury. You cannot command an army you cannot pay. You cannot maintain a superpower without the economic foundation to support it. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 republics declared independence. The Russian Federation inherited the ruins. The hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time on December 25, 1991. The Cold War ended not with nuclear explosions. It ended with bankruptcy. The aftermath revealed the full scope of American economic warfare. Western economists entered the former Soviet Union and examined the records. What they found was shocking. The Soviet economy had been in decline since the early 1970s. Official statistics showing 3 to 4% growth were fabricated. Real growth had been zero or negative for nearly 20 years. The military-industrial complex had consumed everything. Between 1975 and 1991, the Soviet Union spent an estimated 20 to 25% of GDP on defense, not the 15% claimed in official statistics, 25%. For comparison, Nazi Germany at the height of World War II spent 23%. The Soviet Union had been on a permanent war footing for half a century. The human cost was staggering. Soviet citizens had been systematically impoverished to fund the arms race. The average Soviet worker in 1991 had a lower standard of living than in 1975. Real wages had declined. Consumer goods were scarce. Housing was inadequate. Healthcare deteriorated. The Soviet people paid for military parity with reduced life expectancy and material deprivation. But the most devastating revelation was how unnecessary it all was. The Star Wars program that triggered the Soviet spending spiral never worked. The technology remained theoretical. The space-based lasers were never deployed. The particle beam weapons existed only in research papers. Reagan had successfully bluffed the Soviet Union into economic collapse. The oil price collapse was equally engineered. Saudi Arabia had increased production specifically to deny Soviet hard currency earnings. The timing was coordinated with American policy. The mechanism was deliberate. The Soviets lost $20 billion in annual revenue because American diplomats convinced Saudi princes to pump more oil. Even the Afghan war had been weaponized. The CIA supplied Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. American weapons killed Soviet soldiers and Soviet helicopters. The $15 billion annual cost was amplified by American intervention. The war that bled the Soviet treasury was extended and intensified by American intelligence operations. The extraction system was complete. Every dollar the Soviet Union spent on defense was a dollar not spent on civilian infrastructure. Every ruble diverted to the military was a ruble denied to housing, education, or health care. The Soviet people had been systematically robbed by their own government to fund a competition they could not win. The sovereignty death came gradually. First, the Eastern European satellites broke away. Poland held free elections in 1989. Hungary opened its borders. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution occurred in weeks. Romania's dictator was executed on Christmas Day. The Outer Empire disintegrated because the Soviets could no longer afford to maintain it. Then the Soviet Union itself fractured. The Baltic states declared independence in 1990. Ukraine followed in 1991. The Central Asian republics separated. The Russian Federation was all that remained, a nuclear-armed regional power with an economy smaller than Italy's. The transformation from superpower to regional player took less than 2 years. The Soviet military-industrial complex that once employed a quarter of the workforce was dismantled. Factories that built tanks were converted or closed. Missile silos were abandoned. Nuclear submarines rusted in port. The economic infrastructure built to compete with America became worthless overnight. Millions of workers lost their jobs. Cities built around defense plants became ghost towns. The final accounting revealed the magnitude of the disaster. The Soviet Union had spent an estimated $4 trillion on defense between 1975 and 1991. $4 trillion extracted from an economy that generated perhaps $12 trillion in total output during those years. 1/3 of everything the Soviet Union produced for 16 years was consumed by the military. 1/3 of the labor. 1/3 of the resources. 1/3 of the capital. For what? To maintain parity with an adversary who spent 6% of GDP on defense. To compete with an economy that was generating innovation and wealth while the Soviet system stagnated. To preserve superpower status that existed only in the number of nuclear warheads and tank divisions. The exchange was catastrophically unfavorable. The Soviets paid everything. They received nothing. The Americans understood the mechanism they had deployed. Force the adversary to spend themselves into collapse. Make them choose between military parity and economic survival. When they choose military parity, accelerate the arms race. When their economy weakens, apply additional pressure. Oil prices, technology competition, regional conflicts. Each pressure point bled resources from an economy that could not afford the bleeding. The Soviet Union never recovered. The Russian Federation that emerged from the ruins spent the 1990s in economic chaos. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Organized crime controlled vast sectors of the economy. Life expectancy fell. Birth rates collapsed. The Russian people suffered through a decade of poverty and instability that followed 70 years of communist deprivation. The empire that once challenged American supremacy was broken, not by military defeat, not by revolution, but by an adversary who understood that the most powerful weapon in the modern age is economic pressure systematically applied. The Americans won the Cold War the way great powers always win. They forced their enemy to spend resources they did not have on capabilities they could not afford. The story of the Cold War's end is the ultimate lesson in economic warfare. The Soviet Union thought they could match American military spending through force of will and centralized planning. They didn't realize that economic competition between unequal economies always ends the same way. The smaller economy breaks first. The long shadow of this strategy extends into the present day. The final Soviet payment on debts accumulated during the Cold War was made in 2017. 26 years after the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia was still paying interest on loans taken out to fund the arms race. The economic consequences of losing that competition persisted for a quarter century. Look at modern great power competition through the lens of what happened to the Soviets. When China increases military spending, when they build aircraft carriers and expand naval bases, when they pour resources into matching American capabilities, remember the Soviet experience. Remember that economic output determines sustainable military spending. Remember that authoritarian economies cannot match the innovation and efficiency of market systems. Remember what happened when a command economy tried to keep pace with capitalist competitors. The Americans proved that the most effective way to destroy an adversary is not to defeat them militarily. It is to force them into unsustainable spending. It is to make them choose between military capabilities and economic health. It is to accelerate competitions they cannot afford to lose but cannot afford to win. This is the essence of strategic competition in the modern age. But the Soviet collapse also teaches us something else. Empires are fragile. They appear permanent until suddenly they are not. The Soviet Union controlled half of Europe in 1989. It ceased to exist in 1991, 24 months from superpower to historical footnote. The transition can happen faster than anyone expects when the economic foundation crumbles. When you hear about defense budgets and military spending today, when nations compete to build the most advanced weapon systems, when powers engage in arms races, remember the Soviet Union. Remember that they had 45,000 nuclear warheads. Remember that they fielded 5 million soldiers. Remember that they controlled an empire spanning 11 time zones. None of it saved them when the treasury ran dry. The lesson is universal and timeless. Economic power determines military power. Industrial capacity determines sustainable force projection. National wealth determines how long you can compete in an arms race. Ignore these fundamentals and you end up like the Soviet Union, bankrupt, dissolved. A cautionary tale about the consequences of spending more than you can afford on weapons you cannot sustain. The McDonald's in Pushkin Square today stands on ground where Soviet citizens once queued for bread. It is the perfect symbol of how the Cold War ended, not with missile strikes, not with tank battles, but with an economic system that could produce Big Macs defeating a system that could not produce basic consumer goods. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War in the spreadsheets before they lost it in the streets. They lost it when they chose to match American military spending despite having 1/3 the economic capacity. They lost it when they prioritized superpower status over economic sustainability. If you believe military competition is separate from economic capacity, you will end up like the Soviet leadership in 1991, staring at empty ledgers and collapsing empires. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.